What a great picture to get back into the swing of things with our tutorials. Reflecting October is a great painting for all types of the watercolor skills. We're going to be using rounds tonight, a number 10 or 8, our nice number 1 rigger and liner. We'll be using a number 2 round and a number 6 round. We're going to be using our fall colors, which would be cadmium yellow, cad red. We're going to be using burnt umber. We're going to be using burnt sienna. We're going to be using yellow ochre. We'll be using our ultramarine blue, our cerulean blue. We're going to be using indigo. We're going to be using black. And of course, we'll be using quite a bit of our sap green. We will be using Misket to misket out some things before we start to paint. And we also are going to be using salt tonight. If you look at my picture, you will see, oops, sorry, we're also going to be using some Kleenex to blot. If you look at my picture here tonight, you're going to see where I've misketed. I misketed all of my rocks on the left-hand side. Not necessary to do the right-hand side, but I also misketed some branches and some bushes or trees that I wanted to make more pronounced later on, especially some of your high grasses next to the edge of the lake. We're going to start out tonight with our cerulean blue water, a nice light wash of cerulean blue. And you want to make sure that you keep it really wet. You do not want hard lines in your water. You also want to keep it super wet because we're going to be blotting out the reflective white clouds in the foreground in the water. So as you paint, you want to make sure it stays really nice and wet. You can go around the rocks on the right, but even if you go over them slightly, it's not really going to matter because you're going to be painting them in later and you're using this nice light cerulean. But just keep it super wet. Once you get it all painted in, you want to get your Kleenex and you want to blot out those clouds. They are just in the foreground water. You don't want to go way towards the back of your lake. You're not going to see the reflections in that. In fact, that whole thing is just going to be a light blue, plain blue for right now. So in your foreground on your water, you want to go ahead and blot out some of your clouds. Once you get them blotted out, I used my rigger to drag through some light blue lines. That was just to make it look like the water is rippling a little bit. Might be a slight breeze on the top of the water, so I'm just wetting my rigger, wiping it off and dragging it through that paint to kind of lift some of that paint off. Dab your rigger on a paper towel, go back in, lift some of the paint off. You are actually almost doing it with a dry rigger because you're taking that wet paint off with your rigger instead of putting it on. So where you want those nice white lines, and again, referring to your photo, you are just going to drag your dabbed off, almost dry rigger through that, and it'll lift off your paint for you and leave you with some white lines. Then we're going to allow that to dry, and we're going to go right to our left hillside. And we're going to start to paint in our left hillside both the really pale umber dirt and our green grass on each side of the dirt. So I'm using some really watered down burnt umber first, and I am painting in my pathway. You can make your pathway wherever you want it to be, but as I get closer or higher up towards the trees, I'm going to go ahead and just wet that umber off with some plain water so that I don't get a hard line in my trees. It does not matter about bringing it down towards your water because that's going to be your darker grasses anyway. But you want to keep it as a light color, a light umber. Then once you've done that, while it's still a little bit of wet, you want to go and deepen your umber slightly just with some more pigment, and then create your path. Create a rounded path, create a straight path, whatever you want your pathway to be. And then we're going to go in with watered down sap. Still my walkway area is wet. And I'm going to bring that sap down into my wet umber so that I have a softer blend on each side of my trail for now. I will dry brush later, but for now I want it to be nice and soft. Now we're going to start to do our trees. We're going to be doing our trees individually because we want to get a hard edge in between those clumps of trees. That's the only way that you're going to get a nice separation of those trees without a lot of effort. So I'm using my sap. I'm going to be doing sections of trees. Putting on my sap first, leaving a rough edge. I don't want it to be like a lollipop tree. Leaving a rough edge, however you want to do it, either painting or dry brushing it. And then along the inside edge, I'm going to be dropping in some black. The sap has to be green. The sap has to be green. Of course it's green. The sap has to be wet for you to drop in your black shadows, and you're dropping in that black to show the depth of those trees. They're not flat, they have a dimension. So when we drop that little bit of black in on each of our clumps of trees, we're going to be dropping it in near the bottom and on the left-hand side. That's going to create some depth into those trees. You can salt that once your black has been dropped in. And then you want to move on to another clump of trees, leaving a section in between each of your tree clumps that you're working on, so that you're never really going to be working on wet. You're going to be working wet up against dry. If you want additional colors on your tree, such as burnt sienna or yellow ochre or even a little bit of red, you can go ahead and drop that in right on your sap, but you want to make sure that your sap is nice and wet. Then you can throw your salt on. If you've already thrown your salt on and you want to add more color, you can still do that. Just drop those colors right into that salt, and those salt particles will help to carry your color through your tree clump. Again, you do not want to be working wet against wet. You want to be working wet against dry. When those trees dry, or you can help it along with your hair dryer, then you can go back and work up against those. But you don't want to do wet against wet. You're going to do your whole section of lower trees, not the covered mountain in the back of trees, but you're going to be doing that whole strip along the lake, and you'll also be doing that strip on your left in the foreground. Same way. Put your color on, whatever colors that you want, let it be nice and wet. Put your black in on the left or in the bottom, and then go ahead and throw on some salt if you'd like. While I'm working with my sap, I'm just going to go ahead in and do that little bit of a grassy knoll on my right hand side, painting around my rocks. I'm not really going to be working a whole lot of color into that right this minute. You can throw some salt on now if you would like, but while I have my sap, I'm going to go ahead and do that. Put my little bit of shadowing in between my rocks and in my little bit of grassy area, not a whole lot, and throw on my salt. And now I'm going to go back and work on my trees. You can work on your trees throughout this entire picture. Even when we're down working on the water, you don't have to have all of your trees totally done. You can go back and forth and back and forth. You can go ahead and watch the video before you start to paint any more trees, or you can just go ahead and continue to do those trees for probably the next 15 minutes or so on your video, 10 minutes or so. You're just going to be working on trees. I won't be doing any dialogue because it'll probably just be more annoying because you're going to be doing the exact same thing on all of your trees. So you can, not worry about so much listening to the video as watching it because there will not be any dialogue for a little while. Now there you go. Our whole tree line is painted. Nice, great colors, some fall colors. Now to do that back mountain of color, I mixed some sap with a little bit of cerulean blue and a little bit of indigo just to give it a little bit of a bluish tone. Not a lot. It still looks green, but it just is slightly different. I'm going to paint in that whole mountain area. I'm going to give it an uneven edge, either by dry brushing or manually painting it in that way. And I'm going to paint the whole thing in nice and wet before I do the same thing. Adding my little bit of black along the lower edge and a couple little dots within the mountain, and I will throw on a little bit of salt. Not a whole lot of salt. I didn't salt the whole thing because I don't want it to look speckled. I just want a little bit of texture here and there. So I painted it all in first, nice and wet. Then I will add my black shadow, my depth tones, and then I will throw in that little bit of salt. Now comes the fun part. All of your reflections in the water from your trees. Do not let this scare you. It is not difficult. You want to re-wet your water where those reflections are going to be. You want to make sure that water is nice and clean. Do not use dirty water. Make sure you put it on nice and wet so it doesn't start to dry on you. And you are actually just going to put in some reflective colors. Look at your photo for a minute. Look at where you can see color through those reflections in the water. That's where we're putting in some of your color. I used reds, I used yellow ochres, and then I used some saps. My sap I actually mixed with some indigo and some black so it would be just a little bit darker. The reflective blue water, greenish blue water, goes over this. So you want to make these reflective fall colors really intense because they are going to have a wash put over them of an indigo mixed with some sap and black. If you put these colors on too light, you're not going to see them through the second wash. So even though when you put them on now, you are thinking that they are going to be way too bright, they will not be. It's easier to put a second wash of the darker water on than to not have enough brightness in your first wash of fall colors. So plan it that they are pretty intense. You want them to be able to bleed, so you want that to be nice and wet, and you want to take that along the edge horizontally where you see it in your picture, and then you also want to bring that all the way down your left hand side. There's no salting on this. No salt. You don't really need the salt. And like I said, you can go back in as long as you're wet. Add some more intense colors. Add some ochres over where you may have put some sap, but just make sure they're nice and intense. Now I'm going back up to my pathway. I want to make my pathway more distinctive, so I'm using some watered down umber, and I am dry brushing at a diagonal and horizontal to re-emphasize that pathway. And then I will do the same thing with some of my sap to re-emphasize my grassy areas. Now would be a good time to change your water because we're going to be doing our sky and we want that to be nice and clean. I'm using my same blue that I used for my water, and I am putting on a nice super wet sky, and then I'm going to blot out my clouds. Once I have blotted out my clouds, I'm going to go back in, and where my blue sky is still wet, I'm going to drop in some additional color. The same blue, but I'm just going to drop in a little bit more of it. If you want to reblot, you can, but I just want my sky to have some areas that are a little bit bluer in some areas so that it's not all the exact same blue. You want to get it on nice and wet before you start to blot so that it'll blot back out to your white, nice white clouds. Long, thin clouds, roll your Kleenex or paper towel. Your fatter, rounder clouds, you can just bunch your Kleenex and lay it on and hold it for a minute. And then, as I said, I went back into some of my areas where my sky was still nice and wet, and I just added some additional color, same color. Now I'm going to be putting a wash on my lake that is in the midground. I'm just going to put a nice wash, the same blue color, but I'm leaving a couple little white strips here and there to look like the sheen on the lake. And then once I get it all painted in, I'm going to throw some salt on it. My area on my left should be dry now from what I put on before. So now I'm going to put on some additional color. I just want to break up anything that looks really smooth, and I want to make sure that the areas that I have under my hanging tree branches, are going to be nice and darker in color to look shadowed. I don't want anything to be too light that's going to be under an overhang of branches and trees. I love the dry brushing because I love that nice roughness that it makes it look like the grass is growing out over onto the path, which makes it look so realistic. Again, you want to make sure that you have your directional dry brushing correct. You don't want to be going straight up and down vertically, and you don't really want to be going straight across horizontally. It's more of like a diagonal type area. When I start to put in some of my darker colors, that's just at the base of the clumps of grass, because you want those to be nice and dark. There's no light that's really getting down there. So I'm going to start to deepen that color towards the bases of those clumps of wild grasses. I'm also going to be putting some of that dark color along the edge of my rocks and water. That's just because there's no light that gets down into that area. These dark colors are going to be met up with that dark water. So even though that looks a little bit stark and drastic right now, it will not once you get the dark reflections in the water from all of the thick trees. Now, I strongly, strongly suggest that you watch the next part of the video first, where I'm doing all of the reflections, the dark reflections. Watch that whole part before you start to paint so that you know what to expect. You are going to be doing a dark reflective color on the water of sap and indigo and some black. You are going to water it down. You're going to be working with your big number 8 round and also your rigger, both at the same time. So you want to have them both handy. You want to mix a nice big puddle of this color. You do not want to have to stop and remix the color. You want this whole thing to be really wet the whole time you're working on it, and you're only going to work a couple inches at a time so that you don't run the risk of the edges starting to dry on you. Watch this whole part first. It's, a few minutes, but it will save any mistake that you possibly could make doing these reflections. Watch it first, then you can back it up and paint with it if you want to, but you will know what to expect. Once you get your wash put on, you can deepen your wash a little bit with some more indigo. Your reflection should still be nice and wet. So now you can go back in and kind of separate out some tree clumps. It will soften itself in the nice wet reflections, but it'll just change up the color slightly, and it'll also make it look like there are separate clumps of trees in your reflections. That's why you want to remain nice and really wet, so that when you go back in and add that little bit of color here and there, it's going to soften itself in the original reflection that you put on initially. Perfect. No salting, no nothing. Let it dry. Now we're going to go back to the shoreline again. If you haven't roughened it up enough with some dry brushing, go ahead and do that now. You can add some additional colors. You can add some more umber here and there. You can add some sienna or just simply some more sap green if that's what you would like. But you can roughen it up. It should not be smooth. At the very end, we will be doing some splashing, a very little bit, but again, you're just breaking up some of that smoothness now. We're going to begin to paint the rocks over on the right hand side. I used both umber and I used some watered down black. I used some sienna. You can paint those rocks all different colors if you'd like, or simply one color. It's up to you. I threw salt on some of them. I also blotted some with a paper towel, and by blotting those, I gave my rocks a little bit of texturing. Don't get carried away. These aren't rocks that are huge, and they are not really the texture of them is not going to be real visible. But if you want to do a little bit of texture here and there, that's great. Just use your paper towel or some salting. Don't worry about any of the shadowing yet. That will certainly come later. But you can paint as you go. Paint a couple now, move to something else. Maybe you're not done with your trees, whatever. But you want to get all of your rocks painted in. On the left-hand side, I'm going to start putting in my shadows that are the reflections of those rocks in the water. So again, using some indigo and some watered down black, I am putting some reflections in the water. They don't extend out real far, but I'm putting a little bit of reflective color in the water where the rocks are sitting. I want to finish up my water, so I'm going back to my original light blue watercolor, and I'm just doing some additional ripple lines in the water with that blue. Not many. I mean, you're not putting in, ripple lines from your foreground to the very front of your paper. You're just doing a couple here and there. You can refer to your picture, or you can just simply do it with, wherever you want, but not a lot. You don't want to take away, and you definitely don't want to do too many over your clouds, because you don't want to lose those nice reflective white clouds in your water. I'm going back to the back now because I put all of that beautiful dark reflection in my foreground water. So there has to be reflection in the background also from all of those trees, but it's not as wide because it's way in the background and there's no detail to it. So I'm just doing like a thin line of that indigo black sap color all along my shoreline towards the background. I'm using my rigger to pull out some lines just so it's not a perfect, 1/4 inch line the whole way across. I'm going to go back to my right hand side little area now, and I'm going to start to separate out my rocks from my hillside. I'll put in a little bit of black with some umber, and then I'm going to dry brush that up my hillside, up into that grass, to break up any smoothness that is there. It shouldn't be nice and smooth. You want it to look rocky and sandy, a little bit of stones. And then we're going to start to take off our misketing on our rocks on the left so we can start to paint those in. They will be painted in exactly like the ones on the right. Same thing, umber on some, maybe some sienna or watered down black. You can salt a few, you can texture a few with a paper towel, but again, these rocks are not close, so you're really not going to see a whole lot of texturing. It's more the coloring. You also don't want to make it look like a rainbow of colors, so your color changes should be subtle. Paint those all in, and then once they are all painted in, then we're going to go and we're going to be doing some shadowing on those later. I'm putting in some grasses. The grasses in the water, not the reflections of the grasses, just the grasses themselves. You can do those at your convenience. They don't have to be done at any special time. And I'm going to take off the rest of my misketing now. I have misketing in my trees. I have some bushes or smaller trees in the background that are misketed. The rest of my rocks, the grasses, all that misket's going to start to come off now, and I can start to paint that in. I put the misket on for a reason. I wanted those things that were misketed to remain lighter than everything else. So there's no reason for you to have put misket on something and then paint it a dark sap with black. I'm going to try to keep anything that I misketed either yellow ochres or some, rusty color oranges or some lighter greens, some sap with some yellow ochre or sap with some yellow. And I am going to be painting in those trees, bushes, branches, same way. If you're painting in a tree like I am now, that is a light rusty color, I'm painting it in, but I'm still going to add that little touch of black on the left-hand side to give it some depth and to give it some separation from those other clumps of trees. The bushes or anything growing from the ground, you want to put your black then at the base and let that work its way up. Again, you're doing that to show depth and to give dimension to those trees and those hedges and those bushes. Continue to take your misket off. You can take it all off at one time or piece by piece, whatever works best for you. But you want to take your misket off and continue to paint everything in. Trees off in the distance, whatever colors you would want. But again, if you misketed them, it's best to try to keep them lighter in color because you didn't misket them and go to all that trouble to paint them the exact same color of everything else. So my trees that are off in the distance there, I'm going to paint those a nice rusty color also to keep them nice and light. Getting all my misket off of my rocks now and my grasses, and that will all get painted in. My grasses will be a nice light sap. Some will have sienna in the bases, especially those clumps, because most of the grasses are brown where they're hitting the water anyway. So painting those in, you want to make sure that you've painted them nice and thin with a rigger. Even though you might not have any misketed, you can still paint some grasses, darker sap or some burnt umber. They don't all have to just be what you misketed. You can add additional grasses to both sides. You can see on the right, I finished off my grasses in the water. And now I am going to be putting in all of my shadows on my rocks. The sides of all of my rocks are going to get shadowed. That's going to give my rocks a dimension and show that they have sides to them, that they are jutting out of the water, and it will make them look much more realistic. So on both sides, both the rocks on my left and the rocks on the right are going to have their sides shadowed in with some watered down black. Continuing on with the shadows, I will put a little bit of a shadow in the water. That's just the reflection of the rock in the water. Make sure that that is evident because that will make it look more realistic also. And then, of course, we have to have the reflection in the water of those tall grasses growing out of the water. I just used some watered down indigo for those shadows. You don't want those shadows to be perfectly straight. You want to kind of wiggle them a little bit because they are in water and the water has movement. So from the base of your grasses going downward, you're going to make all of those little reflective lines. They are not to the bottom of your paper. They're only about as big as the grasses themselves. So if you made short grasses, then your lines can be shorter. If you made tall grasses, you can have taller lines, but they don't reach to the bottom of your paper. And last but not least, what I had mentioned before, our little bit of splatter. I'm using my wisp brush, but you could use your fan. And I'm using some black mixed with some burnt umber. And I am doing a little bit of splatter on my walkway. And then a little bit of watered down indigo. And I'm doing a little bit of splatter in my water in the background. A little bit of indigo. You can mix that with a little bit of cerulean if you would like. Don't get carried away, but just a little bit of splatter to give your water a little bit of wind. Great painting. Perfect for October. Happy fall. And definitely happy painting. Enjoy.